But natural selection, as we shall see hereafter, is a power incessantly ready for action, and is immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. Charles Darwin. My name is Anita Raj, and let's delve deep into the messages contained within this quote, which is the premise of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, as illustrated in his novel On the Origin of the Species. English naturalist Charles Darwin, born in 1809, would permeate the scientific community of the world, his name appearing in the evolution chapter of nearly every biology textbook published. In the work On the Origin of the Species, Darwin overturns hundreds of years of beliefs in independent creationism, evolution by the habit of use, and the separate evolutionary pathway of intellectually superior humans. He presents his research justifying that species have evolved due to natural selection and descent with modification, supporting this thesis by explaining various mechanisms of evolution that we will look at by examining the 16 chapters of his novel. I will also share my analysis to answer why On the Origin of the Species is a world classic. When aboard the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836, Darwin traveled to South America to study its species. After returning to Great Britain in 1837, his failing health and competing naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace ushered Darwin to publish his abstract. He proposes species are not independently created, rather descended from previous forms, suggesting components beyond climate and food influence adaptations. Darwin puts forth natural selection. Only the fittest will be favored and survive in their environments, revealing modifications ancestors underwent, along with possible modifications present species will undergo. Examples include the woodpecker's beak and the parasite's ability to attach to a host. He emphasizes the need for a scientific approach and experimentation as proof, using detailed observation of wild and domesticated species. By expressing doubt about the validity of his theory, he allows future evolutionists to have the flexibility to respond to his conclusions. When Wallace published on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type, he agreed with Darwin on the existence of natural selection, but suggested that man had an analogous but different path of descent with modification than other animals because man has a superior intellect. While theologians believed God created all species and disagreed with Darwin, Darwin saw the natural world as a power of its own. Darwin explains domestic species vary to a greater degree than wild counterparts. Scientists suggest this variation is only due to the environment, but Darwin suggests that there is a genetic basis for evolution, reproduction. Darwin also rejects the theory of the habits of use in which the frequent use of body parts yields variation. Although he agrees that the frequent use of legs or wings makes a duck stronger, reproduction is a better basis of variation. Parents can pass variation to their offspring, and this is why rare traits can appear in a lineage. Darwin concedes that the laws of inheritance were not fully understood and that it was unclear if species were descended from parent species. He did experiments with domestic pigeons and found they produced viable offspring when crossed, meaning they shared a common ancestor, the rock pigeon, disproving the long-held belief of breeders of multiple common ancestors. Darwin defines artificial selection as a process by which the breeders may unconsciously select which characteristics are most favorable to them. Gradual changes can lead to different breeds, such as the selection of speed and size to develop the English racehorse. Darwin does not completely disagree with evolutionists such as Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who believe that environmental factors influence variation solely, but he asks why these favorable traits reappear in offspring, such as the strong legs of ducks being passed to their ducklings. Overall, Darwin uses scientific experimentation and inductive reasoning with his rock pigeon breeding to prove his theories of the properties of artificial selection. He remains open-minded and does not outright reject Lamarck's ideas. Lastly, when Darwin developed his theory of heredity being the basis of variation, he implies a degree of doubt, leaving space for welcome disagreements. Darwin establishes a connection between domestic variations and natural variations by identifying 3 types of natural variations: monstrosities, environmentally incited, and heritable. In regards to taxonomic labels, Darwin attempted to establish the following definition for struggling taxonomists: different species have a greater amount of differences than variations of the same species. Darwin then discusses dominant versus smaller species. Dominant species are larger groups with diverse subspecies and better survival, while smaller species have less variation. Darwin mentions an experiment with 2 species of plants growing in the same garden. He mentions how theologians believed God was the reason for evolutionary variety, but if this was the case, the smaller plant species would have the same amount of variation as the dominant. Darwin once again emphasizes his uncertainty about defining species versus variations, allowing German biologist Ernest Mayr to prove that the distinction was that species could reproduce within their group but not outside of it. Darwin also contradicts the idea of God's creation of varieties. By proving that heredity and the environment are the key factors for variation, Darwin disproves creationism. Darwin explains how the struggle for existence is the reason some species survive while others go extinct, and survival is dependent on variations that help organisms adapt to unique environments. An example includes the diving nature of the beetle. Traits that are favored are then passed to offspring because their parents survived the trials of nature. The limits of population is also a factor, for nature can provide food and habitat for organisms but is finite, resulting in a battle for resources. Climate change and disease can change the availability of resources, and competition, such as predation, will favor some species. Similar to Thomas Malthus, Darwin believed that each population grows steadily, but the death rate will remain the same, so natural selection will set a limit on the number of organisms to occupy the space in the world, which would become the logistic model. Therefore, organisms must compete and threaten one another's survival. Competition forces organisms to survive and have progeny that will inherit traits to help them survive in the environment. An organism can outcompete another organism. A species with a larger population is optimal because it will have more surviving members after a disaster. Sometimes, the survival of one species is dependent on another. Planting a certain tree and preventing cattle from grazing can encourage the growth of other species. Additionally, Darwin highlights the fatal beauty of nature because it provides sustenance but can destroy species through limitation and competition, an enlightened view deviating from religion. Darwin raises the question of human population limits and gives his evolutionary theory a modern perspective. Nature is finite, but our population continues to grow, so will humans compete or cooperate in the future? The premise for natural selection is established in this chapter. Just like a breeder, nature can select traits. While breeders often pick traits they favor, nature picks traits man cannot understand but may help a species. Nature can also limit species by not granting adaptations, making species less likely to survive and pass on their traits, driving them to extinction. Examples include how a wolf's streamlined body gives it speed to outrun predators, how a bear cub will seek out abundant prey, and how a plant will adapt colorful petals or sweet nectar to attract insects. Variations that are not favored will go extinct. Darwin introduces sexual selection, for the key to survival is procreation. Successful males have variations that may not help in survival, but make them more attractive to females, so these males are more likely to mate and pass their traits to offspring. Examples include male birds singing, showcasing their colorful plumes, or employing other behaviors for females. Geographical isolation results in isolated islands having a restricted gene pool, but organisms perfectly adapted to their niche, while open regions have species that are flawed but can survive in very dynamic habitats. Over time, variations are favored and accumulated, creating more divergences from the common ancestor. Darwin shows a tree in his novel to illustrate how subspecies branch off of species from the common ancestor. Unfortunately, Darwin explains the divergence of species when he has not clearly defined what a species is yet. He does not answer how variations occur in organisms, only answered when Hugo de Vries explained genetic mutations in 1903. Darwin also argues that natural selection took thousands of years to occur, arguing with scientists who said certain natural phenomena did not occur simply because scientists could not observe them in their lifetimes. In his rhetoric, Darwin uses terms such as immigrants in his explanation of geographic isolation. This would pave the path for social Darwinist belief that immigration to the United States led to the lower standards of society before the progressive movement. Through sexual selection, he perpetuates the idea that men instigate and decide a reproductive relationship, while females have no choice. Lastly, Darwin admits that nature is better at selecting than breeders, establishing a hierarchy in which man is a subject of nature. Variations are not random, but are related to the living conditions of the environment. Darwin first proposes that variations occur due to the use or disuse of organs. For example, birds living on the ground do not use their wings, and cave dwellers are usually blind. Darwin calls this effects of habit, where the use or disuse of an organ modifies its structure so it is more advantageous, and these variations are inherited. However, heredity will take precedence over the effects of habit. Variations usually occur in homologous organs that develop during embryonic stages, including the arms and legs. However, Darwin cannot explain the inheritance of a useless trait that follows a useful one, such as the appearance of blue eyes and deafness in cats. Darwin states that variations tend to occur in an organism's most highly developed and specialized organs. For example, the organs that a species uses the most, such as a bird's wings, show high degrees of variability. By comparing the variability between two related species, scientists can determine their common ancestor. Darwin also found species tend to revert to traits from their early ancestors, such as horses crossed with zebras exhibiting stripes, while pigeons can have blue coloration like their parent, the rock pigeon. Here, Darwin shows the flaws in the theory of creation, for if it were true, all species would be subject to equal variation and would not revert to the common ancestor. However, Darwin contradicts himself when he says heredity is a tool for variation, but he does not fully understand heredity. Surprisingly, Darwin tries to relate nature to God, saying nature is just as powerful and beautiful as God, and that God cannot turn his back on nature. There were questions of how, if species are descended from a common ancestor, different species exist rather than intermediate forms, and how natural selection produces complex organs such as the eye from parent species lacking these organs altogether. As an answer to the first question, Darwin explains that intermediate forms go extinct because offspring would be better adapted and outcompete them. Darwin struggles a little more in answering the second question. He is able to give evidence of the flying squirrel already possessing a parachute-like tail. Over time, organs such as the eye will accumulate modifications until perfection is achieved, and all intermediate forms will be discarded. Useless organs may have been useful to a distant ancestor at some point in time, but not presently. But the organs were still inherited because natural selection does not create immediate perfection in a species, temporarily ignoring traits that will not harm a species. Darwin is seen accepting that he cannot answer all questions against natural selection, but can apply his principles to the majority. Darwin shoots another arrow at theologians. Natural theologian William Paley said the telescope was an example of the complexity with which God created the eye, but Darwin explains that the millions of years of natural selection better explain the gradual, not immediate perfection of the telescopic eye. In the future, social Darwinists would ask, based on natural selection, if society would never stop progressing or if it could degenerate. Darwin gives full attention to objections from scientists who have read his theories. One criticism is that defining characteristics such as long hair or ear structure appear in organisms but do not have an influence on survival, to which Darwin counters that these may be the vestiges of what may have been advantageous. Darwin also opposes St. George Mivart, who asks, if the giraffe's long neck is beneficial and natural selection is always active, why other animals have not adapted this long neck? Darwin counters that there was food available closer to the ground for other species, so it would be a waste of energy to develop a long neck like a giraffe, introducing the idea of ecological niches. Even though we cannot explain why mutations occur in one species but not another, it is not reason enough to say natural selection is not at work. Other critics ask why ostriches cannot fly, even though flying is an advantage to birds. Darwin warns that the same trait can have detrimental effects on one species even if it benefits another. Ostriches are large animals requiring abundant food to fuel their wings, but they live in the desert with sparse vegetation. Darwin introduces instincts in this chapter. While they are consistently performed actions like habit, Darwin believes they are inherited, not learned. While the causes of instincts are unknown, Darwin thinks that habits lead to the construction of instincts. Natural selection acts on instincts the same way as variations, favoring the instincts that will help an organism survive. Examples of an innate but beneficial instincts include hens that lay eggs in other nests to produce offspring without caring for them, slave ants that care for the entire population, and hive bees that can make honeycombs with honey efficiency. Darwin conducted an experiment in which he gave hive bees different sizes of wax, and they shaped it into the same shape every time. However, Darwin voices a fatal flaw in his theory. In some ant colonies, worker ants that differ in size and instincts are sterile, so how are their variations passed to future generations? Darwin explains natural selection favored fertile ants that could produce sterile workers because the workers benefited the whole ant colony. This chapter is special in that it is about inheritable mental traits. Darwin also implies that intelligence is a key factor in competition, hinting that humans are superior because of their application of their instinctual intelligence. Social Darwinists would ask if intelligence was therefore passed on from intelligent parents, and if the smartest humans are the most likely to survive and populate society. In addition, because fertile ants are not choosing by habit to produce sterile offspring, Darwin sets the premise for Mendel and Rice's work with heredity and genetic mutations. Darwin discusses the creation of hybrids. Sometimes when two purebred species interbreed, they produce few fertile offspring, but this measure of fertility is not universal. For example, when he crossed Crinum capense and C. revoltum, fertile offspring were produced when this was not the same outcome with many other crosses. Darwin establishes that hybrids are made from the breeding of two different species, are usually sterile, and are more susceptible to unfavorable conditions in the environment. They are accidents, malformed because of reproductive system differences in the parents. He discusses how that there can be physical barriers that prevent the formation of a hybrid, such as the male element being unable to reach the female element, known as reproductive isolation. So he concludes there is no evolutionary benefit to hybridization. Darwin's main struggle was identifying that genes were the basis for sterility in offspring, but with Mendel's work, it is now known that incompatibility in chromosomes results in inviable hybrid offspring. The theory of natural selection is not supported by the geological fossil record because paleontologists would be finding the intermediate forms between parent and present species, but this was not the case. Instead, Darwin argues the geological record is imperfect, and due to changes in the land, intermediate fossils may have been destroyed or lost. Citing Lyell's Principles of Geology, Darwin explains that the surface of the Earth is constantly changing, as can be seen in the sediments of the seacoast, rivers, oceans, and other bodies of water. For example, soil erosion occurred for 300 million years in England's Weald Forest. Therefore, many other species have existed than we have catalogued, but they may have decayed in the ocean because the sediment preserving them could not withstand damage from the waves. Natural selection implies slow modification, but paleontologists have seen the abrupt appearance and disappearance of groups without any intermediate forms. Eventually, geologists would answer the inconsistencies of the geological record, and Mendel would show that mutations could result in immediate and sudden, not gradual, changes in the population, so Darwin was only astray about the speed of inheritance. Darwin discusses gradual descent. Extinction is not avoidable and mysterious to Darwin, who supposes that the struggle for existence and natural selection determine which species survive and which die out. When two similar species exist, they provide the greatest competition. One will win and become abundant, while the other dies out unless it can adapt to another niche. While natural selection acts on individuals rather than whole ecosystems, Darwin says natural selection can occur at the same time globally, where the geology in different parts of the Earth's surface changes in a similar way simultaneously, a process called parallel succession. For example, the limestone chalks in Europe, North America, and South America. This leads to organisms developing similar adaptations, but they will not remain separate forever because they can migrate, and the introduction of new species will create competition. New species tend to be more complex in comparison to previous forms because natural selection tries to perfect organisms so that they can survive and propagate. However, Darwin does note that less organized forms do exist because their environments do not demand much of them. For example, species from Great Britain can survive anywhere in the world, but species from New Zealand are weaker. Meanwhile, fossils in Australia reveal that lesser forms exist in South America. Darwin concludes that over time, less complex organisms will die out. Social Darwinists would apply this principle to race and economic background, claiming people of color or the poor were lesser humans. Darwin even says Great Britain has superior species that can adapt wherever they are planted in the world, a bias that would be translated to divisions in human society because of ethnic background. Isolation and migration can cause species to develop in certain environments, a theory supported by both Darwin and Lyell. Barriers to migration are found in separate landmasses such as Australia, Africa, and South America, leading to different species. When migration is impossible, species become very distinct and highly adapted to their environments. Other organisms have adapted ways to migrate. For example, plants can float on seawater or be carried inside a bird or insect past geographic barriers. While other scientists believe islands broke off of the mainland, Darwin suggests that geographic changes did not occur fast enough to cause speciation. Instead, changes in sea levels created aquatic barriers, leading to the development of new species, followed by isolation, letting these new species migrate onto the island. Darwin cites the glacial period, or the Ice Age, as evidence of the impact of geological change on species. A land bridge between Western Europe to America, called the Bering Strait, may have enabled the migration of species to the Americas before the rising sea cut off this bridge. In addition, due to the rising of rivers, we find similar species in separate freshwater ecosystem. In addition, ducks could have carried plants and shells on their legs, and their excrement may have held seeds. Islands have more endemic species because they are not able to migrate, but they have similarities to species on the mainland, such as the Galapagos and South America. However, Darwin is uncertain if a migratory species can survive in its new environment. For example, seeds may be taken to places where soil will not allow growth. Animals may migrate to places with high predation, and climates might be too extreme for survival. Darwin explains the classification system is arbitrary unless referring to species, emphasizing that homologous internal structures such as reproductive systems and embryos are more important to find evolutionary relationships, a study called morphology. Examples include the similar bone structures of the human hand, dog leg, whale fin, and bird wing, along with skulls and vertebrae columns. Embryology reveals that the embryos of organisms such as humans and chickens are similar but diverge as they develop, getting inherited traits like eye, skin, and hair color later in life because of mutations that made them better suited to their niches. Rudimentary organs are unimportant leftover organs, such as membranes on wingless insects or swim bladders in fish. Natural theology cannot explain why the same organ can be found in multiple species, but this also proves natural selection is not perfect in leaving out unneeded structures. Darwin was the first to explain why organisms should be grouped a certain way and showed how the imperfect state of organisms opposes independent creation. He boldly brings humans onto the scene, leading to social theorists believing some human races progressed further evolutionary and promoting discrimination and even genocide. Darwin summarizes his main points and admits there are still objections to his theory because humans are not willing to accept that they have descended from other organisms and cannot fathom the amount of time it takes for evolution to occur. He thinks his theory will lead to a revolution where religion and a greater understanding of the natural world in which natural selection exists will coexist. Mendelian genetics and the mutation theory would lead to the Darwinian revolution. Although he's critical of theologians, he accepts God as the ultimate creator where there are gaps in his theory. Understanding 4 crucial themes in On the Origin of the Species can reveal why this work is a world classic. In Darwin's theory, nature is the cause of the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, not God. Nature can provide species with the adaptations they need to survive and propagate, but also limit them by competition and extinction. Darwin hence challenges creationism by God. Throughout the chapters of Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, Darwin makes sure to use a scientific method, inductive reasoning, and evidence from experiments to support his theories. He has done extensive research while aboard the HMS Beagle on Galapagos species, such as the finches, crossing rock pigeons and their descendants, observing how hive bees shape wax, and more. Unlike other scientists of his time, he is able to use evidence to support theories he knew would be widely criticized by the scientific community. Darwin's peers believed that organisms were in their perfect states already, but Darwin claimed that they were continuing to progress gradually towards perfect adaptation to the environment. More and more variations appear that are favored over previous traits. Lastly, Darwin includes humans in the same evolutionary process other species undergo, a concept other scientists denied at the time. For example, Wallace agreed with Darwin on natural selection but believed humans underwent a separate path of descent because of their superior intellect. Darwin questions the God-bestowed uniqueness of humans by comparing human structures to homologous structures in other animals, such as the human hand to the whale's fin. Therefore, Darwin expresses that humans were created not by God, but by natural processes. Although Darwin's On the Origin of the Species may have been widely criticized during his time, it is now considered a world classic because of its artistry in life, truth, and knowledge. Thank you for listening.